Hi, you're listening to Defend Your Time, brought to you by Ontinu. I'm your host, Chris Taylor. This is the podcast where we help you get stronger security, more value, and fewer headaches out of your Microsoft security investments. In this episode, I'm joined by Ryan Hulls, Microsoft security consultant at Ontinu, as well as Rob Smith, CEO and founder of Lionfish Tech Advisory, also former Gartner analyst. Apart from owning an MSSP, Rob also was an executive at VeriSign dealing with identity. And that's what today's episode is all about. We've just published the latest Microsoft Security Licensing Guide, which is available. You can find the link on the blog post below the podcast details. This is an exciting discussion. Anybody who's curious about identity, getting the most out of Microsoft Security, specifically Entra or Microsoft Defender for Identity, we're going to have a good conversation today. The Attack Surface Map, a new feature. We'll talk about risk-based conditional access and everybody's favorite topic, MFA. Let's get into it. Rob, Ryan, welcome. Thank you for joining today. Rob, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. Before founding Lionfish, I was a Gartner analyst for 8 years where I covered identity as well as endpoint security. In fact, we used to speak at the Identity Access Management Conference all the time. And in a prior life to that, as you said in the intro, I was an executive at VeriSign in the early days of using certificates as your identity authentication method for VPNs. If there's one thing I want somebody to walk away from this podcast with, just one fact and only one fact, but is identity matters most. You can build the best security in the world. You can spend literally millions of dollars on firewalls, intrusion prevention, and every other tool known to man. But if the user's identity is compromised, the hacker gets that user security level. And I think it's such a basic concept that's lost on so many people. They focus so much on defending the enterprise, but are really ignoring defending the identity. Lots of stats out there confirming that 80% of all attacks right now are identity based. If I'm a user, I click on a phishing link and bam, you now have my access. You now have full rights as the CEO of Lionfish and everywhere I have access to. What a party.
Great intro, Rob. Thank you. You heard it here. Identity matters most. Okay, Ryan, I asked around here at Ontinu, where we deliver managed security services specifically to Microsoft security customers, who we should have on the podcast. Everybody gave me your name. You've been on this podcast before, but talk to us a little bit about your work on identity specifically here at Ontinu.
So identity is a great deal of what we do when it comes to protecting user environments, whether it be from deploying out the Defender for Identity sensor on-prem, pulling in those on-prem identities to protect that from potentially lateral movement or account takeover. We go into the cloud-based identities, looking at risk-based conditional access policies, the user risk or sign-in risk policies, essentially protecting that activity. Like Rob said, if there's a session takeover, we can provide policies that protect against that. We can use the continuous access evaluation policy to revoke that user session, constantly reevaluating that user risk.
So, Ryan, tell me a little bit about this attack surface map. This is fairly new, right?
Yeah, the attack surface map is relatively new. It's very useful information where we can look at the identity themselves and see where that attacker can move, whether it be another user account to enumerate potentially a saved admin sign-in session, or we can look at devices that that user account has access to and look at that path that attackers might take to pawn the environment.
Okay, so at Ontinu, we just published a guide, Maximizing Your Microsoft Licensing, really to try to help clarify some of the confusion around what's included in different licensing tiers. Rob, I'm sure this is something you ran into quite a bit when you were managing your own MSSP. What are the big differences between E3 and E5 when it comes to identity?
Sure. I mean, I feel sorry for any end user who's trying to figure out Microsoft licensing at this point. If you go right now, this second, at time of recording, and go to Microsoft's website and look at their comparison table, the very first thing you see is Azure AD. Well, Azure AD, of course, has been renamed. And so if you have the internal Microsoft comparison table, it says Entra ID, but for the poor public, it still says Azure AD. It's so confusing. Now, to give Microsoft props, one thing I will say they did was they finally added in MFA into E3. Initially, MFA was part of E5. If you don't know what MFA is, MFA stands for multi-factor authentication. What I mean by that is you use a second device instead of just username and password. Everybody knows passwords can be hacked. Everybody knows passwords cause IT more headache than probably any other problem an end user has. So going to multi-factor is great because it gets rid of the challenges around passwords in that you now have a second device, typically your mobile, with the Microsoft Authenticator app or another third-party app to say, okay, this really is Rob Smith. But, that's still not enough. What we're seeing is various hacking attacks that Ryan can talk about in much more detail than I can. Those are still able to possibly compromise MFA or take over the session. And so the coolest new feature that you get out of E5 is risk-based conditional access. And with that, it's not only just saying, okay, this is Rob Smith because he's done his username and password, he's done his MFA, but it looks at patterns of my behavior. Where in the world am I? What kind of device am I using? Am I trying to log in with a Linux box, which I've never used before? And other key variables to say this really truly is me, and continuously update this to say, oh, wait, something flagged, something changed, let's kick him out. This should generate an alert.
Ryan, how do you think about risk-based conditional access policies?
I mean, we all know that MFA has been out there for quite a while now. It's been the longest push that we've had, or the best security push we've had, from protecting against essentially account takeovers for a few years now. It all really comes down to defense in depth measures. First, we set up our MFA. We want to make sure we're protected there, that we're using modern auth and not legacy authentication. After we get our MFA set up, now we start putting in our conditional access policies and start protecting the identity after the fact. If we have MFA there, but the user has a high sign-in risk, we may want to block their access out of the environment, or we may want to remediate and have them reset their password. We can automate those processes using the conditional access policies for us to take some pressure off of our tier 1 assets. On top of that, we have our identity protection suite to look at that identity after the fact to see if there's going to be a potential impact to greater than just that host asset that could have been breached with a user contact.
So Ryan, what's one thing that you see most frequently that you wish customers were more aware of?
That they still have legacy policies in place and they're still actively being used. I do see a lot of companies that believe they're on modern auth, but when we go in and view the user registration details, we can see that SMS and voice calls are still allowed for MFA. Those very easy to breach MFA methods. They're not phishing resistant. One of the best things you can do is go into your Azure authentication methods policy, look at that managed migration. Are you in the pre-migration stage? Are you in the managed migration in progress stage? Both of those options still respect the legacy policies from the admin.microsoft.com portal. Going in and verifying that legacy MFA is turned off inside of the O365 environment is critical moving forward. The reason I point that out is in less than a year, on September 30th, 2025, Microsoft is turning off all the legacy authentication and self-service password reset policies inside of the O365 environment. The last thing you want to do is be caught in that transition phase and a company is trying to move to that modern auth at the same time of staying in production without having any breaches. Typically, that breach pattern is still based off from legacy authentication not being accounted for in a corporate environment.
I think the reality situation, to Ryan's point, is that most IT managers have no clue that Microsoft is discontinuing this. And we've seen that in the past with many versions of Windows when Microsoft cut support for XP, and we kept trying to warn everyone over and over and over again. The very first day after support was cut, we had more inquiries than we could count. Well, now how do we support the fact that we have security vulnerabilities? This is a continuous problem, and quite frankly, IT people never have time to deal with anything.
Sounds like a lot of people are going to have a bad day October 1st, 2025.
I plan on being very busy.
Okay, Rob, Ryan, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for listening. This is Defend Your Time, brought to you by Ontinu. If you're interested in learning more about how you can strengthen your own identity security, come talk to us. Join our Defender user group and connect with other users of Microsoft security products. Please subscribe and have a great day.